Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished mopping the marble floors of the Crystal Palace's eastern wing. The ornate spires and gleaming walls of the Draconian Empire's royal residence stretched endlessly around him, each corridor more magnificent than anything he'd seen back on Earth. 3 months ago, he'd been just another unemployed janitor in Detroit. Now he was the head custodian of the most powerful empire in the galaxy, though he suspected his human status had more to do with political convenience than his cleaning skills. The Draconian High Council had been eager to demonstrate their progressive values by hiring humans for menial positions. After all, what better way to show the galaxy that the mighty Dragon Lords were benevolent rulers than by giving jobs to the newest species to achieve faster-than-light travel? Marcus didn't mind the condescension. The pay was incredible, and the work kept him busy enough to avoid thinking about how far from home he really was. A soft whimpering sound echoed from the marble alcove near the grand staircase. Marcus paused, listening carefully. The sound came again, barely audible but distinctly distressed. He'd learned to recognize the various noises the palace made during his time here, from the rumbling snores of the adult dragons in the upper chambers to the mechanical hums of the gravity generators. This was different. Following the sound, Marcus discovered a small golden wyrmling, no bigger than a house cat pressed against the wall behind a decorative pillar. The young dragon's scales were dull with stress, and its tiny claws scratched nervously against the smooth stone. Its large amber eyes looked up at Marcus with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Hey there, little guy," Marcus said softly, crouching down to the wyrmling's level. "You okay?" The wyrmling chittered quietly, a sound Marcus had never heard before from the proud adult dragons who ruled this place. Without really thinking about it, he reached out slowly, letting the small creature sniff his hand. The wyrmling's nostrils flared, taking in Marcus's scent before it suddenly pressed its warm head against his palm. Marcus felt his heart melt a little, despite their fearsome reputation. This tiny dragon reminded him of a lost puppy. "You're scared, aren't you? What are you doing down here all alone?" The wyrmling made a soft trilling sound and, to Marcus's surprise, scrambled up his arm to perch on his shoulder. Its weight was negligible, maybe 5 pounds at most, and its scales felt surprisingly warm against his neck. For a moment, they simply sat together in comfortable silence. "Cleith! Cleith! Where are you?" The booming voice of High Nursemaid Vexara echoed through the corridors, her massive claws clicking against the marble as she searched. Marcus had met the imposing green dragon once during his orientation. She was responsible for the royal nursery and had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting the young dragons in her care. The wyrmling on Marcus's shoulder immediately began trembling, pressing closer to his neck. Marcus could feel the tiny creature's heart beating rapidly against his collarbone. Whatever was happening in the nursery, this little one wanted no part of it. "Cleith," Marcus whispered to the wyrmling, "is that your name?" The young dragon looked up at him with those enormous amber eyes and chirped softly. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. "Okay, buddy. Let's get you somewhere safe while the scary lady calms down." Marcus carefully made his way to the custodial closet that served as his makeshift office, the wyrmling still clinging to his shoulder. The small space was filled with cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment, but it had a comfortable chair where Marcus ate his lunch. He settled into the chair, and Cleith immediately curled up in his lap, tucking his small head under one wing. For the next 2 hours, Marcus worked on inventory reports, while the tiny dragon slept peacefully against his stomach. The wyrmling's breathing was slow and steady, occasionally accompanied by the softest of purrs. Marcus found himself unconsciously stroking the warm scales along Cleith's back, marveling at how trusting the little creature was. When High Nursemaid Vexara's searches finally moved to other parts of the palace, Marcus gently woke Cleith. "Come on, little guy, you should probably go home now." But as soon as Marcus stood up, Cleith scrambled back up to his shoulder and refused to budge. The Wyrmling wrapped his tiny claws in Marcus's uniform shirt and made distressed noises whenever Marcus tried to remove him. "You really don't want to go back there, do you?" Marcus asked, studying the young dragon's behavior. In his experience with earth animals, creatures didn't flee their homes unless something was seriously wrong. "Tell you what, if you promise not to get me fired, you can hang out here while I finish my work," Cleith chirped happily and settled more comfortably on Marcus's shoulder. For the rest of the day, the Wyrmling accompanied Marcus on his rounds, watching with curious eyes as the human cleaned and maintained the various chambers. Other palace staff gave them odd looks, but no one questioned the head custodian's unusual companion. It wasn't until Marcus was preparing to leave for the day that he encountered real trouble. High Nursemaid Vexara appeared in the main hallway, her massive form filling the corridor as she blocked Marcus's path. Her emerald scales were perfectly polished, and her golden eyes burned with barely contained fury. "Human," she said, her voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. "You have something that belongs to me." Marcus felt Cleith press closer to his neck, the small Wyrmling trembling again. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'm not sure what you mean." Vexara's lips pulled back, revealing teeth the size of daggers. "Do not play games with me, Custodian. The Wyrmling Cleith has been missing from the nursery all day. I can smell him on you." "He seemed upset," Marcus said carefully. "I was just keeping him company until he felt better." "Upset?" Vexara's laugh was like grinding stone. "Wyrmlings must learn discipline. They must understand their place in the hierarchy. Comfort makes them weak." Her massive head lowered until her nose was inches from Marcus's face. "Return him to me. Now!" Marcus could feel every muscle in his body tensing for a fight he couldn't possibly win. Vexara was easily 20 feet long and could incinerate him with a single breath. But the small creature on his shoulder was shaking with terror, and Marcus found he couldn't bring himself to hand Cleith over to someone who clearly saw comfort as weakness. "With all due respect, ma'am," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt. "He came to me. If the nursery was meeting his needs, why would he leave?" The temperature in the corridor dropped several degrees as Vexara's eyes began to glow with inner fire. "How dare you question my methods, human? I have been raising Wyrmlings since before your pathetic species discovered fire." "Then maybe it's time for a new approach," Marcus replied, taking a step backward despite himself. For a moment, Marcus thought Vexara might actually attack him. Her massive claws scraped against the marble floor, and smoke began to curl from her nostrils. Then, unexpectedly, she seemed to regain control of herself. "Keep the Wyrmling for tonight," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "But tomorrow you will return him to the nursery. And if I find you interfering with my charges again, human, I will ensure your employment here ends permanently." With that ominous threat, the high nursemaid turned and stalked away, her tail lashing behind her like an angry serpent. Marcus waited until the sound of her claws faded completely before letting out the breath he'd been holding. "Well, Cleith," he said to the Wyrmling still perched on his shoulder, "looks like we've got ourselves into quite a situation." That night, Marcus took Cleith back to his modest quarters in the staff section of the palace. The Wyrmling explored every corner of the small apartment with boundless curiosity, chirping excitedly at Marcus's earth mementos and electronic devices. When it was time for bed, Cleith curled up on Marcus's chest, purring softly as the human gently stroked his scales. As Marcus lay awake staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just one scared Wyrmling. In his months at the palace, he'd observed the rigid hierarchy that governed draconian society. Everything was about dominance, strength, and showing no weakness. But what if that approach wasn't working for everyone? What if some individuals, even dragon wyrmlings, needed something different? Marcus made another decision that night, one that would put him on a collision course with centuries of draconian tradition. Tomorrow, he wouldn't be returning Cleith to the nursery. Instead, he was going to find out exactly what was happening in that place and why a young dragon would prefer the company of an alien janitor to his own kind. Marcus woke before dawn to find Cleith still curled against his chest, the wyrmling's steady breathing creating a gentle rhythm that had helped him sleep better than he had in months. The small dragon's scales had brightened considerably overnight, shifting from dull gold to a warm amber that seemed to glow with inner light. As Marcus carefully sat up, Cleith stretched like a cat and chirped a cheerful greeting. "Morning to you too, buddy," Marcus whispered, scratching behind the wyrmling's tiny horns. "Ready for another adventure?" Marcus had spent half the night planning his approach. He couldn't simply refuse Vexara's orders without consequences, but he also couldn't abandon Cleith to a situation that was clearly causing the young dragon distress. The solution, he'd decided, was to gather information. If he could understand what was happening in the nursery, maybe he could find a way to help not just Cleith, but other wyrmlings who might be struggling. After a quick breakfast, which Cleith enthusiastically shared despite Marcus's concerns about human food being safe for dragons, they made their way through the early morning corridors of the palace. Marcus had noticed that the vast building operated on predictable schedules. The adult dragons rarely emerged from their chambers before mid-morning, preferring to conduct their business during the warmer afternoon hours when their massive bodies were most comfortable. The nursery was located in the palace's northern tower, a soaring spire that Marcus had never had reason to visit during his regular duties. As they climbed the seemingly endless spiral staircase, Cleith became increasingly agitated, making soft whimpering sounds and pressing closer to Marcus's neck. "It's okay," Marcus murmured, keeping his voice low. "We're just going to look around." "I won't let anything happen to you." The nursery entrance was a massive archway carved with intricate dragon motifs, but what caught Marcus's attention were the sounds coming from beyond it. Even from the stairwell, he could hear a cacophony of distressed chittering, occasional roars, and what sounded unmistakably like crying. As they drew closer, Marcus began to make out individual voices through the stone walls. "Silence!" Vexara's voice boomed from within. "Wyrmlings who cannot control their emotions will not eat today! Weakness is not tolerated in the royal bloodline!" Marcus felt Cleith's tiny claws dig into his shoulder as the young dragon tried to burrow under his collar. Through a narrow window set high in the wall, Marcus could see into the main nursery chamber. What he witnessed made his blood run cold. The room was set up like a military training facility, with young dragons arranged in rigid formations across the cold stone floor. There were perhaps 30 wyrmlings ranging from Cleith's size to others nearly as large as earth horses. They stood perfectly still in neat rows, their heads held high and their expressions carefully neutral. But Marcus could see the trembling in their small forms, the way their tail tips twitched with suppressed emotion. At the front of the formation, Vexara paced back and forth like a drill sergeant, her massive bulk casting shadows over the smaller dragons. Several adult dragons flanked her, all wearing the same expression of stern disapproval. As Marcus watched, one of the smaller wyrmlings, a silver-scaled female, began to sway slightly where she stood. "Zephyra!" Vexara's head snapped toward the struggling wyrmling. "Explain your weakness!" The silver wyrmling tried to speak, but only managed a small, broken chirp. Marcus could see tears gathering in her large eyes, though she fought desperately to hold them back. "Crying is forbidden!" Vexara roared, moving closer to the terrified wyrmling. "Dragons do not show weakness. Dragons do not need comfort. Dragons are strong." With each declaration, the high nursemaid's voice grew louder until the very stones seemed to shake with her fury. The silver wyrmling finally broke, dissolving into heartbroken sobs as she collapsed to the cold floor. Instead of offering comfort, Vexara loomed over her, breathing smoke. "Remove her from formation," Vexara commanded the other adults. "No food today, no rest today. She will stand in the shame circle until she learns control." Marcus watched in horror as the sobbing wyrmling was dragged to a small chalk circle drawn on the far side of the room. There were already 2 other young dragons standing there, their heads hanging in exhaustion and defeat. The silver wyrmling was placed in the circle and left alone, still crying softly as the training continued around her. "This is what discipline looks like," Vexara announced to the remaining wyrmlings. "This is how we forge strength from weakness. You are dragons. Act like it." Marcus had seen enough. He carefully backed away from the window, his mind racing. The nursery wasn't just strict. It was systematically breaking the spirits of young dragons in the name of creating strength. No wonder Cleith had fled. No wonder the little wyrmling was so desperate for genuine affection and comfort. As they descended the stairs, Marcus's communicator chirped with an incoming message. His supervisor, a middle-aged human woman named Sarah Chen, was requesting his presence in the main office. Marcus's stomach sank. If word had gotten out about his confrontation with Vexara, his time at the palace might already be over. The custodial office was located in the palace's administrative wing, a more modest section where the actual work of running the vast complex took place. Sarah was waiting for him behind her desk, her expression unreadable. She was one of only a handful of humans in management positions at the palace, having worked her way up from janitor to facilities coordinator over the past 5 years. "Marcus," she said without preamble, "we need to talk." "If this is about yesterday," Marcus began, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. "It's about a lot more than yesterday," she said. "Sit down." Marcus settled into the chair across from her desk, acutely aware of Cleith still perched on his shoulder. The wyrmling had been quiet since their visit to the nursery, his bright eyes dulled with sadness. Sarah studied them both for a long moment before speaking. "In the 5 years I've been here," she said slowly, "I've learned to pick my battles carefully. The Draconians have their ways of doing things, and most of the time, it's easier to go along with them than to fight. But sometimes, you see something that you can't just ignore." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. "What do you mean?" Sarah leaned forward, lowering her voice. 3 weeks ago, I was doing inventory in the storage areas beneath the nursery. I heard sounds coming through the ventilation system, crying, lots of it. When I investigated, I discovered that there's a whole network of tunnels down there where wyrmlings go to hide. Marcus's eyes widened. "How many? At last count?" 17. Sarah's expression was grim. "They've been living down there for weeks, maybe months. Living off scraps and drinking from condensation pipes. They're terrified to return to the nursery, but they can't leave the palace grounds without triggering security alerts." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Cleith wasn't the only one fleeing the nursery's harsh conditions. There were 17 other young dragons hiding in the dark beneath the palace, too scared to go home but with nowhere else to turn. "Why hasn't anyone done anything?" Marcus asked. "Because officially they don't exist," Sarah replied. "The nursery reports perfect attendance every day. When wyrmlings go missing, they're marked as undergoing individual discipline training. The High Council never asks questions as long as the reports look good." Marcus felt Cleith shift on his shoulder, the small dragon pressing closer to his neck, as if sensing the gravity of their conversation. An idea was forming in Marcus's mind, dangerous and possibly career-ending, but also potentially life-saving for the terrified wyrmlings. "Sarah," he said carefully, "what if we could offer them an alternative?" "What kind of alternative?" "What if we could prove that there's a better way to raise young dragons? What if we could show the High Council that compassion and understanding produce better results than fear and punishment?" Sarah stared at him for a long moment. Marcus, you're talking about going directly against centuries of draconian tradition. If you're wrong, if this backfires, we'll both be expelled from the Empire, at best. And if we do nothing, Marcus replied. 17 young dragons continue to live in terror, hiding in tunnels like refugees in their own home. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the risks and potential consequences. Finally, she sighed and opened her desk drawer, pulling out a datapad and several official forms. If we're going to do this, she said, we're going to do it right. I'm creating a new department, Experimental Child Development Research. You'll be the director, with full authority to implement alternative care methods for Wyrmlings showing signs of adjustment difficulties. Marcus stared at her in amazement. You can do that? I have budgetary authority for pilot programs, Sarah replied with a slight smile. I've been saving that particular power for when I really needed it. Congratulations, Marcus. You're no longer a custodian. You're now officially a xenopsychologist. As Sarah filled out the paperwork that would legitimize their rescue mission, Cleith chirped softly and nuzzled against Marcus's cheek. The small gesture of affection strengthened Marcus's resolve. These Wyrmlings deserved better than fear and loneliness. They deserved to be treated with the same kindness and understanding that any young creature needed to thrive. Within 2 hours, Marcus had official authorization to establish a temporary care facility in one of the palace's unused conference rooms. More importantly, he had permission to retrieve Wyrmlings who were struggling with traditional training methods and provide them with alternative developmental support. As they prepared to venture into the tunnels beneath the palace to find the hidden Wyrmlings, Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and terror. They were about to challenge one of the most fundamental aspects of draconian society. If they succeeded, they might revolutionize how an entire species raised their young. If they failed, the consequences would be severe. But as Cleith chirped encouragingly from his shoulder, Marcus knew they had to try. Sometimes, the most important revolutions began with a single act of kindness, with one person deciding that the way things had always been done wasn't the way things had to continue to be done. The real test was just beginning. The tunnels beneath the Crystal Palace were a maze of service corridors, maintenance shafts, and forgotten storage areas that stretched for miles through the bedrock. Armed with portable lights and emergency supplies, Marcus and Sarah descended through a maintenance hatch in the administrative wing's basement. Cleith rode on Marcus's shoulder, his golden scales providing an additional warm glow in the darkness. The air in the tunnels was thick and humid, filled with the constant drip of condensation and the distant hum of the palace's massive life support systems. They had been walking for nearly an hour when Cleith suddenly perked up, his head turning toward a barely audible sound echoing through the stone passages. "Did you hear that?" Marcus whispered. Sarah nodded, pointing toward a narrow corridor that branched off to their left. "It's coming from that direction." As they moved closer, the sounds became clearer, soft chittering, the scrape of claws on stone, and what might have been whispered conversations in the musical language of young dragons. Marcus felt his heart race as they approached a wider chamber lit by the faint phosphorescent glow of mineral deposits in the walls. What they found there took Marcus's breath away. The chamber had been transformed into a makeshift living space by 17 Wyrmlings ranging in age from barely larger than Cleith to adolescents nearly the size of small cars. They had arranged broken furniture and discarded materials into sleeping areas, created a primitive kitchen from salvaged equipment, and even established what looked like a small library using maintenance manuals and discarded data pads. The Wyrmlings looked up in terror as the lights appeared in their sanctuary. Several of the smaller ones immediately scrambled behind the larger adolescents, who spread their wings defensively despite their obvious exhaustion. Marcus could see the fear in their eyes, the same expression he'd witnessed on Cleith's face when they'd first met. "It's okay," Marcus said softly, crouching down and allowing Cleith to hop from his shoulder to the ground. "We're here to help." Cleith chirped excitedly and bounded toward the group, calling out in rapid dragon speech. The effect was immediate and profound. The terrified Wyrmlings relaxed slightly as Cleith explained who Marcus was, and several of the younger ones began to creep forward with cautious curiosity. One of the adolescent dragons, a magnificent emerald-scaled female with intelligent amber eyes, stepped forward to serve as spokesperson for the group. "You are the human custodian," she said in heavily accented but clear English. "Cleith has told us of your kindness. I am Wyrmling. We do not wish to return to the nursery." "You don't have to," Marcus replied, his voice gentle but firm. "We're here to offer you an alternative." Over the next hour, Marcus and Sarah listened as the Wyrmlings shared their stories. Each tale was heartbreaking in its own way. Zephyra, the silver Wyrmling Marcus had seen crying in the nursery, had been punished repeatedly for asking questions about her deceased parents. A small red Wyrmling named Custodian had been placed in isolation for 3 days because he'd shared his food with a weaker nestmate. An adolescent blue dragon called Arcturus had attempted suicide twice after being told that his interest in art and music made him unfit for dragon society. The pattern was clear and devastating. The nursery wasn't just using harsh discipline, it was systematically crushing any trace of individuality, curiosity, or compassion in the young dragons. Those who couldn't conform to the rigid expectations were driven away, left to survive on their own in the dark tunnels beneath their ancestral home. "We have official permission to establish an alternative care facility," Sarah explained to the group. "If you're willing to trust us, we can provide you with proper food, comfortable sleeping arrangements, and an education that values your individual strengths rather than punishing your differences." The Wyrmlings exchanged glances, hope and fear warring in their expressions. Finally, Lirelai spoke for them all. "What would you require of us in return?" "Just to be yourselves," Marcus answered. "To learn and grow in an environment where you feel safe and valued. And maybe, if things go well, to help us prove that there's a better way to raise young dragons." The journey back to the main palace took several trips, as Marcus and Sarah carefully led small groups of Wyrmlings through the service tunnels to avoid detection by the regular palace staff. By evening, they had successfully relocated all 17 refugees to their new temporary home in the converted conference room. The transformation of the space had been remarkable. Sarah had requisitioned comfortable bedding, proper furniture scaled for dragons of various sizes, and enough food supplies to keep the Wyrmlings well-fed for weeks. The room's large windows provided natural light and a view of the palace gardens, while adjustable temperature controls ensured everyone stayed comfortable. But the most dramatic change was in the Wyrmlings themselves. Within hours of arriving in their new home, the young dragons began to display behaviors that Marcus suspected hadn't been seen in the royal nursery for generations. They laughed, they played, they asked endless questions about everything from human culture to quantum physics. They shared stories, created art, and even began composing songs in their native language. Cleith had appointed himself as unofficial ambassador between the humans and dragons, translating when language barriers arose and helping the more traumatized Wyrmlings adjust to their new environment. Marcus watched with amazement as the small dragon who had been trembling with fear just days before now confidently led group activities and provided comfort to his fellow refugees. The real test came 3 days later, when High Nursemaid Vexera arrived unannounced at their facility, flanked by 2 imposing adult dragons from the High Council's security force. Her eyes blazed with fury as she surveyed the scene of Wyrmlings engaged in collaborative art projects and enthusiastic learning games. "This is an outrage," she declared, her voice shaking the windows. These Wyrmlings belong in proper training. Look at them. They're playing like hatchlings instead of preparing for their duties to the Empire." "With respect, High Nursemaid," Marcus replied, standing protectively in front of the Wyrmlings, "these dragons are learning more effectively than they ever did under the previous system." "Learning?" Vexara's laugh was like grinding stone. "What could you possibly teach them that centuries of dragon wisdom could not?" Before Marcus could respond, Lyrelay stepped forward, her young voice clear and confident. "High Nursemaid Vexara, may I demonstrate?" Without waiting for permission, the Emerald Wyrmling began to recite a complex mathematical proof, seamlessly transitioning between 3 different languages as she explained advanced concepts in theoretical physics. Her presentation was followed by Arcturus performing an original composition that incorporated traditional dragon harmonics with innovative musical structures, and Zephyra presenting a detailed analysis of palace security systems that she had observed and memorized during her time in hiding. The display continued for nearly an hour as Wyrmling after Wyrmling demonstrated skills, knowledge, and creativity that far exceeded anything typically expected of dragons their age. They worked together seamlessly, building on each other's ideas and supporting their companions with encouraging chirps and gentle touches. Vexara watched in stunned silence as these supposedly weak and defective Wyrmlings proved themselves to be exceptionally capable individuals who had simply needed the right environment to flourish. When the presentations finally ended, the chamber fell quiet except for the soft purring of contented young dragons. "Impossible," Vexara whispered, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "This cannot be the same group of failed Wyrmlings from my nursery." "They were never failures," Marcus said quietly. "They just needed someone to believe in them instead of trying to break them." One of the security dragons, an ancient silver male with wise golden eyes, stepped forward. "High Nursemaid," he said formally, "I am Lord Commander Thanatos of the High Council Guard. I have observed this facility for the past hour, and I must report that these Wyrmlings display cognitive abilities, emotional intelligence, and collaborative skills that exceed our highest expectations for dragons their age." Vexara's massive form seemed to deflate slightly as the implications of his words sank in. For the first time since Marcus had known her, the imposing dragon looked uncertain, even vulnerable. "But the old ways," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Strength through discipline, power through dominance, these have guided our species for millennia. And they produced Wyrmlings so miserable that 17 of them preferred to live in tunnels rather than return to their ancestral home," Sarah pointed out gently. "Perhaps it's time to consider that strength can come from other sources." Lord Commander Thanatos nodded slowly. "I will recommend to the High Council that this experimental facility be granted permanent status. Furthermore, I suggest that High Nursemaid Vexara be reassigned to study these new methods so that she might implement similar approaches in the main nursery." The old ways didn't change overnight, but they did begin to change. Over the following months, Marcus's alternative care facility became a model that was gradually adopted throughout the Draconian Empire. Wyrmlings, who had once been labeled as problems, were recognized as individuals with unique talents and perspectives that enriched dragon society. Cleith never did return to the traditional nursery. Instead, he became Marcus's permanent companion and assistant, helping to bridge the gap between human and dragon understanding. The small Wyrmling who had once fled in terror from his own people grew into a confident young dragon who served as an ambassador of sorts, proving daily that kindness was not weakness, and that sometimes the most profound strength came from the gentlest touch. Years later, when historians studied the transformation of draconian child-rearing practices, they would identify it as one of the most significant social revolutions in galactic history. But for Marcus, the real victory was much simpler. It was watching 17 terrified young dragons discover that they were worthy of love, respect, and genuine care. It was proof that sometimes the greatest changes in the universe began not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with one small act of compassion, repeated again and again until it became a new way of being. In showing the dragons how to nurture their young, humanity had demonstrated what made their species truly special, not their technology or their military might, but their fundamental belief that every individual, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, deserved dignity, kindness, and the chance to reach their full potential. The Wyrmlings who had once huddled in dark tunnels now soared through the crystal spires of their palace home, their songs of joy echoing through corridors that had once known only the sounds of fear and punishment. And at the heart of it all was a simple human truth that had traveled across the galaxy to transform an entire civilization. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply treating others with the kindness and respect that every living being deserves.